friends, about a month ago I built this cargo bike and I've been using it all that month, and I've discovered some problems with it. One problem is the crank here is about 1.5 inches too low. Another thing is because I use this swiveling ball joint here, the steering linkage doesn't stay in place. So I think I want to replace this with a rigid bushing. Then we've got the cargo bay. It is way bigger than it needs to be. It doesn't need to be this tall, and it doesn't need to be this long. And because of that, the wheelbase of the bike is way too long. And this thing rides like a tuna boat. And finally, the back of the tire is just a little bit too close to the frame, so I think I want to rework that as well. The kickstand's working pretty decent, but I think I want better spring mounts than those sheet metal screws I used. So there's definitely some room for improvement, and that's what we're doing this week. Okay, let's look at what we are and we are not using. We are using this tube and this tube up here. We are not using that tube or any of the cargo bay. I'm going to rebuild that whole thing. We are using this tube. So let's cut all that stuff off. You know, the homeless people around my town are pretty ingenious. You see them building some interesting stuff. Very resourceful people. I think I'm going to leave this in one of the places where a lot of their junk collects, and we'll see if this shows up on one of their inventions. Okay, now those are back to a usable state. Let's get to work reconstructing the new cargo bay. Okay, so now we chopped up the frame, and I've made a mock-up here. This has the axle at the actual wheel height, and this is propping up the bottom bracket to the level that I want it to be at now. Next step is the main steer tube. I want this perfectly vertical this time, because instead of a ball joint at the pivot, I'm going to have a rigid bushing. So I need to contour this and make a new tube to connect these two here. So with this part of the frame jacked up to the appropriate levels, hanging this so it just dangles straight down, it acts like a plumb bob. And I've fitted the two frame segments together, and then I've also come in with another piece for the bottom. And we will just tack all that together and then work on the new cargo bay. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now to build the cargo bay, the new cargo bay. Now the size of the old one was pretty decent at 20 inches wide, but it was way too long at 36 inches. So I think I'm just going to go with 20 by 20 square. That should do just fine. So the first bend I want to take is what they call the hard way. The easy way is to bend the narrow diameter this way. The hard way is to bend the tall diameter. And I want to get that one out of the way because the easier bends will come easier. I want to make sure these two are the same. Alright, so there's my first two. Okay. One thing that's kind of sucky about this bender is you pretty much have to take it apart to get the tube out once it's bent, because it deforms and presses itself into the sides of the mandrel. Okay, so there's the front of one side. Now I've got to bend it the other way to make the other side. Okay, so those turned out pretty good, nice opposites of one another. Okay, now taking a look at these, they are not an exact mirror image. There's a little bit of deviation in some of the curvatures. Now I could choose to rebuild one side or the other and try to get a more perfect match, but I believe that perfection is the enemy of good enough, so I'm just going to go with it the way it is. It's good enough. Okay, now let's just set that up there. Now this is where the microphone battery died, and what I'm explaining here is how to align the steering geometry. When you look through the head tube, the place where the line lands has to be where the tire contacts the road, and if you get that angle right, you'll have great steering geometry. So many people who build bike frames screw that up. Okay, that is looking pretty good. The alignment's good. Yeah, I think that'll be good. You know, the first welding job I ever had was making aeration tunnels, and it was welding this exact same kind of expanded metal onto this exact same kind of tubing. I guess I've come the full circle. Okay, that's looking better. It's plenty big enough. I think I still want like a fence around the edge, the same way I had on the last one. I'm pretty happy with this. The thing I want to do next, though, is get onto the steering linkage. One thing I want to point out is this tubing bender is kind of a piece of garbage. I'm probably going to end up rebuilding it. It has a bunch of drawbacks, and one of them is that this socket that this tube goes into is too shallow, so it can slip out pretty easily. Now this new tie rod turned out nice. I've got a bronze bushing in there and then the ball joint on the other end. Okay, so here's the new linkage, and that is working pretty good. It's a nice clean look too. I like that. I still need to finish out the cargo bay. I think I want to come in with the 1/4 inch rods the way I did before, and let me get onto that. Now in the first iteration of the bike, I knew it was going to need some shakedown cruises, so I went ahead and painted it. I didn't know how long it was going to last in that first generation. I'm fairly certain I've addressed all the issues that the bike had with all these modifications. So this time, instead of painting it, I'm going to put it together unpainted. Try it out. If it seems like it's good, then I'm going to completely disassemble it and send it to powder coat. So here's my old kickstand, and I think it can be the basis for the new one, but it won't work as is because one thing is it's too short. So just like we did with the rest of the bike, we'll chop it up and rework it. Okay, that is looking okay. Let's see how this spring situation is going to work. Okay, I think that'll work too. I need a spring perch over here though. Looks like my spring and kickstand are in pretty good shape. Let's get this thing back together and take it out for a ride. One other thing I need to do is find a way to lock this bracket in place, because under the torque of applying pressure on the crank, the planetary gear set inside the crank caused it to rotate. This thing is actually for a chain guide, but the people who developed this crank decided to use it as the basis for the planetary gear anchor. Okay, now the approach I've decided to take on this is I've just got this link here, and we're going to attach from there, and then I'm going to weld that nut on there, and then we'll just bolt up right there. Because I welded onto that bottom bracket tube, the bearings have become a serious pain to put on and take off, so I'm just going to leave them in place. I've got my fire retardant fabric here that will keep them from getting splattered on. Then I'll weld this nut on and cool it before the bearings have a chance to heat up. And anyway, you always want to make sure when you're welding around bearings, you want to make sure you clamp right onto the thing that you're going to weld. That way there's no chance the arc can conduct through any of the bearings on the bike. There it is, back together. A couple of the cables are a little bit too long now, but let's take it for a test drive. Now the kickstand has to hold the weight of the cargo, otherwise how's it going to hold? How's it going to stand up while you're loading it? Okay, so we know that this one's good for 230 pounds. The last one was good for 255, but I've lost 25 pounds since then. That thing came together really well, just in time for the warm weather. It's almost 100 today. I'll be getting my exercise. Anyway, the improvements in handling are dramatic. I mean, it's hard to describe just how much difference there is between now and before. Of course, it is a good 15 inches shorter now, so the shorter wheelbase makes it a little more nimble. There's a little bit more flex in this because on the original we had a 1x2 main rail that was the basis for the whole thing. And now we just have this 1/2 by 1 inch. As long as it still handles good with 75 pounds in it, I feel okay about it, and I'll just leave it the way it is. If it turns out needing some reinforcement, I'll get it back in here and we'll do another bonus video on it. But the current plan is to ride it and use it for the next few weeks and see how it works. And if all goes well, we'll tear it back down, send it off to powder coat, and then it'll be back for the final assembly. So that's all for this time. Thanks for stopping in. I'm happy to answer any questions in the doobly-doo below, so please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Click up here to see my last video. Click over here to see something of mine that YouTube thinks you'll like. And have a good one.